On the morning of November 3rd, 1907, a man walked out of the Cascade Range foothills near Enumclaw, Washington, and into the arms of a search party that had long since abandoned hope. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 34 years old. He had been missing for 41 days. He was emaciated, his clothing torn, his feet wrapped in strips of what appeared to be canvas. He carried nothing. When they asked him where the others were, he looked at them as though the question had been posed in a foreign language. There were 3 others: his wife, Catherine, his brother-in-law, Samuel Ross, and Samuel's wife, Margaret. They had gone into the mountains together on September 23rd, an overnight camping trip scheduled to coincide with the first significant snowfall of the season. All 4 were experienced outdoorsmen. Catherine had grown up in logging country. Samuel had worked as a surveyor. It was meant to be routine. When Daniel emerged alone, he did not ask about them. He did not volunteer information. He did not weep. The leader of the search party, a timber foreman named Howard Gale, would later testify before the county coroner that Daniel's eyes were not vacant, but focused on something we couldn't see. Gale asked him directly, "Where is your wife, Mr. Mercer?" Daniel turned his head slowly, as if considering the words individually. Then he said, "I don't know her." It was not defiance. It was not confusion born of exposure or starvation. It was a statement delivered with the flatness of absolute certainty. They brought him down the mountain in a wagon. He sat upright, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He did not shiver, though the temperature had dropped below freezing. He did not speak again for 6 days. By November 9th, Daniel had been transferred to the care of Dr. Oswald Pritchard, a physician in Seattle who had studied nervous disorders in Vienna. Pritchard's notes, preserved in the archives of King County Hospital, describe a patient who was physically recovering but psychologically inaccessible. Daniel ate when food was placed before him. He slept without apparent dreams. He answered questions with monosyllabic responses or silence. Pritchard attempted hypnosis on 3 occasions. Each time, Daniel entered a light trance but offered nothing beyond repetition of the physician's own words. When asked to describe the last thing he remembered before his rescue, Daniel said only, "Trees." Catherine Mercer's family, her father, Thomas Ross, and her younger sister Ida, came to see him on November 12th. Ida would later describe the encounter in a letter to a cousin in Pennsylvania, a letter discovered in an estate sale in 1954. She wrote, "We were told not to overwhelm him, so Father and I entered the room quietly. Daniel was seated by the window. He turned when Father spoke his name, but there was no recognition in his face. Father said, 'Daniel, it's Tom Ross, your father-in-law.' Daniel looked at him as one might look at a stranger offering directions on a street corner, polite but distant. I could not bear it. I stepped forward and took his hand. I said, 'Daniel, where is Catherine? What happened to my sister?' He withdrew his hand, not violently but with the care one uses when disentangling oneself from an unwanted touch, and he said, 'I'm sorry. I don't know who that is.' Father wept. I have never seen him weep before or since." The search for the other 3 resumed immediately upon Daniel's recovery, but the window of opportunity had narrowed. Snow had already begun to accumulate in the higher elevations. The area where Daniel claimed, if his silence could be called a claim, to have no memory of events, was vast, heavily forested, and cut through with ravines that became impassable after the first storms. A second search party, led by County Sheriff Elias Morrow, spent 11 days combing a grid based on the campsite coordinates Daniel and Catherine had filed with the Enumclaw General Store before their departure. They found the campsite. The tent was still standing. Inside were Catherine's wool coat, neatly folded, and a journal belonging to Margaret Ross. The final entry was dated September 24th, the day after their arrival. It read, "Weather fine. Samuel caught 2 trout. Catherine made biscuits over the fire. Daniel is in good spirits. We plan to hike to the ridge tomorrow to see the valley." There was no indication of distress, no signs of struggle. The food stores were intact. The bedrolls were undisturbed. Outside the tent, Searchers found a single set of boot prints leading away to the northeast into dense timber. The prints were consistent with Daniel's size and gait. There were no other tracks, no signs of Catherine, Samuel, or Margaret following, no signs of them leaving in any other direction. Sheriff Morrow's official report noted, "It is as though 3 individuals vanished from a standing position, leaving one to walk away unharmed." When pressed by authorities, Daniel's responses became a kind of liturgy. He did not know where the others were. He did not remember what had happened. He did not recognize the names Catherine Mercer, Samuel Ross, or Margaret Ross. On November 20th, a prosecuting attorney named Calvin Stills was brought in to conduct a formal interview. Stills was known for his methodical approach to witness examination. The transcript of that interview survives in county records. It is 23 pages long. 18 of those pages consist of Stills asking variations of the same questions and Daniel responding with variations of "I don't know" or "I don't remember." But on page 19, something shifts. Stills asks, "Mr. Mercer, do you understand that 3 people are missing? That your wife is among them?" Daniel replies, "I understand what you're telling me." Stills, "But you don't remember her?" Daniel, "No." Stills, "Do you remember being married?" There is a pause, noted in the transcript as lasting approximately 15 seconds. Daniel, "I remember the idea of it." Stills, "The idea?" Daniel, "That such a thing exists." Stills, "But not the person?" Daniel, "No." Stills, "Why not?" Another pause, this one noted as lasting 30 seconds. Daniel, "Because it's better that way." Stills stopped the interview. In his summary notes he wrote, "Subject is either suffering from a complete dissociative break, or he is the most disciplined liar I have ever encountered. I am not certain which possibility disturbs me more. No charges were ever filed. There was no evidence of foul play. No bodies were recovered. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation, and Daniel Mercer was released from medical observation on December 1st, 1907. He returned to the house he had shared with Catherine in the town of Auburn, 15 miles south of Seattle. Neighbors reported that he kept to himself. He did not seek work. He did not attend church. He was seen occasionally at the general store, purchasing only what was necessary. On December 14th, Catherine's father, Thomas Ross, came to the house and demanded answers. According to a witness, a neighbor named Eunice Talbot, the confrontation took place on the front porch and lasted no more than 5 minutes. Ross shouted. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face expressionless. When Ross finally exhausted himself, Daniel said only, "I can't help you," and closed the door. Ross died of a heart attack 3 weeks later. His obituary, published in the Auburn Globe-Republican, made no mention of his missing daughter. Daniel Mercer lived in that house for another 11 years. He rarely spoke to anyone. He did not remarry. He did not leave the state. In 1918, during the influenza epidemic, he became ill. A visiting nurse named Anne Cosgrove attended to him in his final days. In her personal diary, donated to the Washington State Historical Society in 1963, she recorded the following: "Mr. Mercer is dying. He knows it. I asked if there was anyone I should contact, any family. He shook his head. I asked if he wanted a priest. Again, no. Then I asked, perhaps too boldly, if there was anything he wanted to say, anything he needed to confess. He looked at me with the clearest eyes I have ever seen in a dying man, and he said, 'If I told you, you'd be the 4th. Daniel Mercer died on October 9th, 1918. He was 45 years old. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Auburn Cemetery. The bodies of Catherine Mercer, Samuel Ross, and Margaret Ross were never found.' To understand the silence, one must first understand what was lost. Catherine Mercer, née Ross, was born in 1875 in the timber town of Snoqualmie, Washington Territory. Her father, Thomas Ross, owned a small mill. Her mother died in childbirth when Catherine was 9, leaving her to raise her younger siblings, Samuel, born in 1877, and Ida, born in 1880. By all accounts, she carried this responsibility without complaint. Photographs of Catherine, few as they are, show a woman with a direct gaze and a posture that suggests both competence and weariness. In one image, taken in 1896, she stands beside her father outside the mill, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hair pinned back in a practical bun. She is 21 years old. She looks older. She met Daniel Mercer in the spring of 1898. He had come to Snoqualmie to work as an assistant to a land surveyor mapping the expansion of the Northern Pacific Railway. He boarded at the Ross home. Catherine cooked his meals. Within 3 months he had proposed. Their courtship, as reconstructed from letters and diary entries preserved by Ida Ross, was unremarkable. Daniel was polite, reserved, and competent. Catherine was practical, intelligent, and uninterested in romance for its own sake. She wrote to a friend in June of 1898, "He is not passionate, but he is steady. I have had enough of uncertainty." They were married on November 12, 1898, in a small ceremony at the Snoqualmie Presbyterian Church. They moved to Auburn, where Daniel had secured a position with a logging company as a route planner. Catherine managed their household and took in sewing work to supplement their income. By all surviving accounts, their marriage was stable, not passionate, but functional. They attended church together. They entertained Catherine's family on holidays. They spoke of having children, though none came. Daniel's background is more difficult to reconstruct. He was born in Ohio in 1873, the youngest of 4 children. His father was a school teacher. His mother's name is not recorded in any surviving document. By the time he arrived in Washington, both parents were deceased, and he had no contact with his siblings. A former employer, writing a character reference for Daniel in 1903, described him as reliable, quiet, and not given to drink or vice. Another acquaintance, a surveyor named Martin Lyle, said in an interview conducted in 1929 that Daniel kept his thoughts to himself, but he wasn't cold. He just seemed like a man who had already decided what the world was and didn't see the point in arguing about it. Samuel Ross, Catherine's younger brother, was 29 at the time of the disappearance. He had followed his father into the timber trade, but lacked Thomas's business acumen. By 1907, he was working as a contract surveyor for the state, mapping old logging roads. He was gregarious where Daniel was reserved, optimistic where Catherine was pragmatic. He married Margaret Olson in 1904. Margaret was the daughter of Norwegian immigrants, a schoolteacher in Auburn, and by all accounts a steadying influence on Samuel's more impulsive tendencies. They had no children, but were said to be devoted to one another. Ida Ross, in her later correspondence, described Samuel and Margaret's marriage as the kind you read about in novels, full of laughter and small kindnesses. She also noted that Catherine had encouraged the match, despite their father's initial reservations about Margaret's lack of property. The relationship between the two couples, Daniel and Catherine, Samuel and Margaret, was cordial. They saw each other frequently, often sharing Sunday dinners at the Ross family home. They had camped together before, 3 times in the previous 2 years, always without incident. The decision to go into the Cascades in late September 1907 was Samuel's. He had been contracted to survey a potential route for a new logging road and wanted to scout the area before the snow made passage impossible. He proposed it as a brief excursion, 2 nights at most, and invited Daniel and Catherine to join them. Catherine's letters from that summer reveal a woman who was content, but restless. In August, she wrote to Ida, "Sometimes I feel as though I am waiting for something, though I could not tell you what. Daniel is well. The house is in order. I have no complaints, but I think of Mother, how young she was when she died, and I wonder if I am using my time as I should." It is impossible to know if this restlessness influenced her decision to go, but she accepted Samuel's invitation without hesitation. Daniel's motivations are even more opaque. He left no letters, no diary. His employer noted that he requested the time off without explanation, which was unusual but not alarming. A co-worker later recalled that Daniel had seemed more thoughtful than usual in the weeks leading up to the trip, but could provide no further detail. Margaret Ross kept a diary, portions of which were found in the tent. The entries from early September describe ordinary domestic life, lessons prepared for her students, a new recipe attempted, a minor argument with Samuel over a borrowed tool. There is no sense of foreboding, no hint of anything unusual. On September 22nd, the day before their departure, Margaret wrote, "Samuel is eager for this trip. He says the mountains are most beautiful just before winter. Catherine seems glad of the change. Daniel, as always, is hard to read, but he agreed readily enough, and that is something." They left Auburn on the morning of September 23rd, 1907, in a wagon driven by a local farmer named John Pitts, who transported them to the trailhead near Enumclaw. Pitts would later testify that the four were in good spirits. Samuel joked about the weight of Margaret's pack. Catherine chided him gently. Daniel helped load the supplies without speaking, but Pitts noted that he didn't seem troubled, just quiet, like he always was. Pitts was the last person to see all four of them alive. They hiked into the foothills, following a route Samuel had mapped previously. The terrain was familiar to all of them. The weather was clear. They reached their intended campsite, a clearing beside a tributary of the White River, by early afternoon. Margaret's final diary entry, dated September 24th, describes an uneventful first night. They cooked fish Samuel had caught. Catherine made biscuits in a cast-iron pan over the fire. Daniel, according to Margaret, sat looking at the fire for a long time. But when Samuel asked if he was all right, he said he was only thinking. Thinking about what? Margaret did not record. What is known about their relationships must be inferred from fragments. Catherine's letters suggest a marriage built on mutual respect, but lacking in intimacy. She wrote to Ida in 1905, "Daniel is a good man. I do not doubt his care for me. But there are parts of him I will never know, and I have made peace with that." Samuel, by contrast, wore his affections openly. His letters to Margaret, written during his surveying trips, are full of endearments and domestic detail. He missed her cooking. He thought of her when he saw wildflowers. He signed every letter, "Yours, in all things." Did Daniel resent this openness? Did Catherine envy it? There is no evidence to suggest discord between the couples, but there is also no evidence of deep friendship between Daniel and Samuel, or between Daniel and Margaret. The bond, such as it was, existed through Catherine, and yet they went into the mountains together. They shared a tent, a fire, meals. They trusted one another enough to be vulnerable in a place where vulnerability could mean death. That trust, whatever its foundation, would not survive the mountain. The last confirmed sighting of all four together is the evening of September 24th, 1907, at the campsite beside the tributary. After that, the historical record fractures into inference, contradiction, and silence. What is known comes from physical evidence and Daniel's sparse, evasive statements. What is unknown eclipses it entirely. The search party that combed the area in November found the campsite undisturbed, as previously noted. But a more detailed analysis, conducted by Sheriff Morrow and a deputy named Lawrence Finch, revealed small anomalies. The fire pit contained the remnants of two separate burns. The first, corresponding to the evening of September 24th, based on Margaret's diary, had been built with care, using dry wood and arranged stones. The second burn, layered above the first, was chaotic. The wood was damp, as though gathered hastily. The stones had been displaced. Morrow's report speculates that the second fire was built in haste, possibly in the early hours of September 25th. But by whom and under what circumstances he could not determine. Inside the tent, Catherine's coat was found folded on top of her bedroll. The folding was precise, the corners aligned. Beside it was a hairbrush, a spare pair of woolen socks, and a small leather New Testament inscribed with her name. All of her personal effects, in other words, remained in the tent. Margaret's diary was found beneath her bedroll, as though she had slipped it there before sleeping. The final entry, "Daniel is in good spirits. We plan to hike to the ridge tomorrow to see the valley," offered no clues. Samuel's belongings were similarly undisturbed. His pack contained a compass, a folding knife, a coil of rope, and a tobacco pouch. The rope, significantly, had not been used. The knife was clean. Daniel's belongings were absent. His pack, his bedroll, his spare clothing, none of it was in the tent. At first, investigators assumed he had carried it with him when he left. But when Daniel was found, he had nothing. No pack, no supplies, only the torn clothing on his back and makeshift wrappings on his feet. When asked what had happened to his belongings, Daniel said, "I don't remember bringing anything." When shown a photograph of his pack, taken before the trip by Samuel as part of a series documenting their preparations, Daniel studied it for a long moment and then said, "That could belong to anyone." The boot prints leading away from the campsite were the only physical trace of movement. They led northeast into a dense stand of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The terrain there is steep, the ground covered in a thick mat of moss and rotting wood. Visibility is poor even in daylight. The prints were clear for approximately 200 yards, then vanished where the ground became rockier. Search parties followed the trajectory for another mile, but found nothing. No further prints, no broken branches, no fabric caught on thorns. Sheriff Morrow noted in his report, "It is possible that Daniel continued in this direction and simply left no further trace. It is also possible that he doubled back, or that he was not the one who made the prints. We have no way of determining which." When asked if he had walked away from the camp alone, Daniel said, "I don't remember walking." When asked how he had traveled from the campsite to the location where he was found, 41 days later and nearly 30 miles to the west, he said, "I don't know." When asked if the others had been alive when he left, he said, "I don't remember them being there." The location where Daniel was found is significant. It was not on any established trail. It was not near water. It was a barren ridgeline, exposed to wind and weather, with no shelter and no food sources. Under normal circumstances, a man trying to survive would avoid such a place. He would seek lower ground, a stream, a forest where he could forage or trap game. Daniel was found on that ridge, standing upright, lucid, and looking west toward the lowlands. Howard Gale, the timber foreman who led the search party, described the moment in his testimony. "We came over the rise and there he was, just standing there. At first we thought it was a scarecrow or a trick of the light, but then he turned his head and looked at us. No surprise, no relief, just looked. I called out, 'Mr. Mercer, is that you?' And he nodded. I asked if he was hurt. He said no. I asked where the others were. He said he didn't know. I asked how long he'd been standing there. He didn't answer." Gale later estimated that Daniel had been on that ridge for at least several hours, possibly longer. His feet were badly damaged, frostbite, lacerations, infection, but he had not sat down. He had not sought shelter. He had simply stood facing west, waiting. For what, Gale could not say. Dr. Pritchard's medical examination, conducted on November 5th, provides a clinical portrait of a man who should not have survived. Daniel had lost approximately 30 pounds. His body fat percentage was critically low. He exhibited signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition. His feet, as noted, were ravaged. Several toes would later require amputation, but there were no signs of violence, no defensive wounds, no bruising or fractures, no evidence that he had fought for his life or fled in panic. Pritchard wrote, "The patient's physical condition suggests prolonged exposure and deprivation, but his injuries are inconsistent with the chaotic flight one would expect from a man lost in the wilderness. There is a precision to his suffering, as though it were endured rather than inflicted." When asked how he had survived without food, Daniel said, "I must have eaten something." When asked what, he said, "I don't remember." When asked if anyone had helped him, he said, "No." When asked if he had helped anyone else, he was silent for 30 seconds, then said, "I don't think so." The question of what happened between the evening of September 24th and the morning of November 3rd obsessed investigators, journalists, and the families of the missing. Theories proliferated. Some believed Daniel had killed the others in a fit of madness and blocked out the memory. But there was no blood at the campsite, no signs of struggle, no bodies. Others speculated that the four had been attacked by animals, by transients, by something unforeseen, and that Daniel had fled in terror, leaving the others behind. But there were no tracks other than his own, no evidence of predation or scavenging. The tent had been left standing, the supplies intact. A minority opinion, voiced by a journalist named Peter Hollis in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, suggested that the others might have left voluntarily, abandoning Daniel for reasons unknown. But this theory failed to account for Catherine's coat, Margaret's diary, Samuel's rope. Why would they leave behind the very items they would need to survive? And why would Daniel refuse to say they had abandoned him? The most persistent theory, advanced by Thomas Ross before his death, was that Daniel knew exactly what had happened and was concealing it out of guilt or self-preservation. Ross hired a private investigator, a former Pinkerton agent named Carl Webb, to re-interview Daniel in December 1907. Webb's report, filed on December 30th, is brief and bleak. He wrote, "Subject refuses to engage with questioning. When pressed, he does not become defensive or hostile. He simply reiterates that he does not remember. I have interviewed liars, cowards, and madmen. Mr. Mercer is none of these. He is a man who has made a decision, and no amount of pressure will alter it." One detail easily overlooked appears in the testimony of Anne Cosgrove, the nurse who attended Daniel in his final days. She noted that Daniel, in his delirium, spoke several times in his sleep. Most of it was incoherent, fragments of words, murmured names. But on one occasion, 2 nights before his death, he said clearly, "They shouldn't have followed." Cosgrove, puzzled, asked him the next morning what he had meant. Daniel claimed not to remember saying it. She asked if someone had followed him out of the mountains. Daniel looked at her and said, "No, I followed them." Then he closed his eyes and would not speak again that day. The silence Daniel Mercer carried out of the mountains did not dissipate with time. If anything, it calcified, becoming less a symptom of trauma and more an architecture of refusal. By the winter of 1907, the disappearance of Catherine Mercer, Samuel Ross, and Margaret Ross had become a minor scandal in the territory. Newspapers in Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane ran speculative articles. The Tacoma Daily Ledger published an editorial on December 8th titled "The Man Who Forgot His Wife," which called Daniel's amnesia convenient and implied cowardice, if not malice. Public opinion was divided. Some saw Daniel as a victim, a man so shattered by an unimaginable event that his mind had fractured in self-defense. Others saw him as a liar, a murderer who had perfected the art of evasion. A smaller group saw him as something more troubling, a man who had chosen silence deliberately, not because he couldn't speak, but because he wouldn't. The families of the missing were united only in their anguish. Ida Ross, Catherine's younger sister, never married. She lived with her father until his death in 1908, and then alone in the family home in Snoqualmie until her own death in 1947. Her correspondence, donated to the University of Washington archives, reveals a woman consumed by the need to understand. In 1909, she traveled to Auburn and attempted to visit Daniel. He refused to see her. She left a letter, which she copied into her diary. It read, "Daniel, I do not write to accuse you. I write because I must believe there is some part of you that remembers my sister. You lived with her. You made promises to her. If you cannot speak to the authorities or to her father, then speak to me. Tell me what happened. Tell me so I can bury her, even if only in my mind. I am begging you." Daniel did not reply. Ida tried again in 1911 and again in 1914. Each time she received no response. In a letter to a cousin dated April 1915, she wrote, "I have come to understand that Daniel's silence is not passive. It is an act of will. He has decided that whatever happened in those mountains will die with him. I hate him for it, but I also pity him, because I cannot imagine what truth could be so terrible that it must be guarded with such ferocity." Margaret Ross's family, Norwegian immigrants with limited English and even more limited resources, did not have the means to pursue answers the way the Rosses did. Margaret's mother, Astrid Olsen, wrote a single letter to the county sheriff in November 1907, asking if her daughter's body had been found. The reply, signed by Sheriff Morrow, said simply, "No remains have been recovered. The case remains open." Astrid died in 1910. Her obituary, published in the Auburn Globe-Republican, listed Margaret as deceased, 1907. There had been no death certificate, no body, but the family had chosen certainty over ambiguity. Margaret's father, Henrik, lived until 1923. He never spoke publicly about his daughter's disappearance. A neighbor interviewed in 1950 as part of a historical survey of early Auburn settlers recalled that Henrik went to his grave believing his son-in-law had done something terrible, but he was too old and too tired to fight for the truth. Samuel Ross, the most gregarious of the four, left behind a small but devoted circle of friends. Several of them attempted to confront Daniel in the months following his return. In January 1908, a group of 3 men, 2 former surveying colleagues of Samuel's and a family friend, came to Daniel's house in Auburn. According to a police report filed the following day, the men demanded to speak with Daniel. When he refused to open the door, they forced entry. Daniel was found sitting at the kitchen table. He did not resist. He did not flee. When the men shouted at him, accusing him of cowardice, of murder, of abandoning their friend, Daniel sat in silence, his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance. One of the men, a surveyor named Eugene Marsh, later testified that he had grabbed Daniel by the collar and demanded to know where Samuel was. Daniel had looked at him and said very calmly, "I don't know him." Marsh struck him. Daniel did not defend himself. The other men pulled Marsh away and left. No charges were filed against Daniel. The men were fined for trespassing and warned against further contact. The legal system, such as it was, found itself in an unusual position. There was no evidence of a crime, no bodies, no witnesses, no confession. Daniel's amnesia, whether genuine or performed, rendered him simultaneously suspect and untouchable. In February 1908, prosecuting attorney Calvin Stills convened a coroner's inquest to determine whether Daniel could or should be charged with any offense. The inquest lasted 3 days. Witnesses included Dr. Pritchard, Sheriff Morrow, Howard Gale, John Pitts, the farmer who had driven them to the trailhead, and Daniel himself. The transcript of Daniel's testimony is remarkable for its brevity. He was asked 47 questions. To 43 of them, he replied, "I don't know" or "I don't remember." To the remaining 4, he gave the following answers. Q. Do you believe your wife is dead? A. I don't know. Q. Do you feel responsible for what happened to her? A. I don't know what happened to her. Q. If you could remember, would you tell us? A. I can't answer a question about something I can't do. Q. Do you want to remember? A. No. The final answer provoked an uproar in the courtroom. Stills demanded clarification. Daniel refused to elaborate. The judge threatened to hold him in contempt. Daniel said nothing further. The inquest concluded with a verdict of insufficient evidence to determine cause of death or assign culpability. The disappearances were classified as unresolved, and the case was shelved. Dr. Pritchard, the physician who had overseen Daniel's recovery, continued to follow the case long after his patient had been released from care. In a letter to a colleague in 1910, Pritchard wrote, "I have treated soldiers who witnessed horrors in war, and I have treated men who suffered catastrophic losses. I have seen minds retreat from reality in the face of unbearable pain. But Daniel Mercer is different. His amnesia is selective in a way I have never encountered. He remembers language. He remembers how to eat, how to walk, how to navigate society. He remembers abstract concepts, marriage, family, obligation. He simply claims not to remember the specific people to whom those concepts once applied. This is not the pattern of traumatic amnesia. It is the pattern of deliberate excision. He has cut them out of his memory, not because he cannot bear to remember, but because he has chosen not to." Pritchard's conclusion was bleak. If I am correct, then Mr. Mercer is not a victim of his mind's collapse. He is its architect. The pressure on Daniel did not abate. Strangers accosted him on the street. Shopkeepers refused to serve him. Children threw stones at his house. In March 1908, someone painted the word "murderer" across his front door in red paint. Daniel cleaned it off without comment. In July 1909, a brick was thrown through his window with a note attached, "Tell the truth or leave." Daniel boarded up the window and remained. He did not defend himself. He did not protest his innocence. He simply endured. A minister from the Auburn Presbyterian Church, Reverend Thomas Calhoun, visited Daniel in 1910 and urged him to confess, if not to the law, then to God. Calhoun later recounted the conversation in his personal journal. I told him that silence was a kind of lie, and that lies corrode the soul. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, I have nothing to confess. I asked if he truly believed that. He said, I believe it's better if I do. Calhoun left troubled. He wrote, I do not know if Daniel Mercer is a man who has forgotten or a man who has chosen to forget. But I know this. He is not at peace, and he does not seek it. By 1912, the disappearances had faded from public attention. Newer tragedies had replaced them. The case files were moved to storage. The search parties were disbanded. The families, exhausted, turned inward. Daniel continued to live in Auburn, a ghost among the living. He took odd jobs, carpentry, road work, anything that required no conversation. He was known to be reliable, if strange. Employers learned not to ask questions. In 1915, a journalist from the Seattle Times tracked him down and requested an interview. Daniel agreed, which surprised everyone. The interview took place in his kitchen. It lasted less than 10 minutes. The journalist, a young man named William Stokes, asked if Daniel had anything he wanted to say about the events of 1907. Daniel replied, no. Stokes asked if he had made peace with what had happened. Daniel said, I don't know what happened. Stokes asked if he ever thought about Catherine. Daniel looked at him for a long time, then said, I don't know who that is. The article was never published. Stokes later told a colleague that he had expected evasion or hostility, but what he encountered was something else. He wasn't lying, Stokes said. At least I don't think he was. It was more like he'd locked a door inside himself and thrown away the key, and he wasn't sorry about it. In the final years of his life, Daniel became nearly invisible. He spoke to no one. He left his house only when necessary. He was seen occasionally, sitting on his porch at dusk, staring at the mountains. When Anne Cosgrove, the visiting nurse, cared for him during the influenza epidemic of 1918, she noted in her diary that he seemed relieved to be dying, not eager, but resigned. He has been waiting for this, she wrote. Not for death exactly, for the end of waiting. On his final night, October 8, 1918, Cosgrove asked if there was anything she could do for him. Daniel shook his head. She asked if he was afraid. He said no. She asked if he had regrets. He said, only one. She asked what it was. He said, that I came back. The historian's task in cases like this is not to solve but to reconstruct. And what we reconstruct from the life and silence of Daniel Mercer is not a mystery in the traditional sense, but a portrait of a choice, deliberate, sustained, and absolute. The archive offers us fragments, a diary entry, a boot print, a painted door. We arrange them into timelines, into narratives, into questions. But the answer, if one exists, remains beyond reach. Daniel made certain of that. By any objective measure, Daniel Mercer had opportunities to speak. He was questioned by physicians, sheriffs, prosecutors, ministers, and family members. He was threatened, pleaded with, and attacked. He had 41 days alone in the wilderness, and 11 years after that, to reconsider his silence. He chose it every time. This was not the silence of confusion or trauma. Dr. Pritchard's assessment, though speculative, is difficult to refute. Daniel's memory was not shattered. It was edited. He remembered the framework of his life, but excised the people who had populated it. He remembered marriage, but not his wife. He remembered companionship, but not his companions. This is not how amnesia works, but it is how control works. What, then, was he protecting? The simplest explanation is that he was protecting himself from guilt, from prosecution, from the unbearable weight of memory. But this explanation falters when examined closely. Daniel did not live the life of a man fleeing guilt. He did not move to a new town, change his name, or build a new identity. He remained in Auburn, in the house he had shared with Catherine, surrounded by people who despised him. If he had wanted to escape, he could have. But he stayed. Nor did his silence resemble the silence of the guilty. When accused, He did not deflect or justify. He did not construct elaborate lies. He simply denied knowledge over and over with the patience of a man repeating a mantra. If he was guilty of something, he never acted like it. A darker possibility is that Daniel was protecting the memory of the others, not from the world's judgment, but from something worse, from the truth of what they had become or what they had done in those final hours. This theory rests on a single phrase, spoken in delirium and recorded by Anne Cosgrove. They shouldn't have followed. If we take this seriously, and we must, because it is one of the few unsolicited statements Daniel ever made, then the narrative shifts. It is no longer a story of Daniel abandoning the others. It becomes a story of the others pursuing him, or pursuing something. But why? And to what end? Margaret's diary, cheerful and mundane, offers no hint of discord. The campsite, orderly and intact, suggests no panic. If there was a rupture, it happened suddenly, completely, and left no physical trace. Unless the rupture was not physical. There is a letter, discovered in 1961 among Ida Ross's papers, that has never been satisfactorily explained. It was written in 1916 by a woman named Eloise Merritt, a teacher in Enumclaw who had known Catherine slightly. Merritt wrote to Ida after reading a newspaper article about the disappearances. The letter is brief, but one passage stands out. I hesitate to mention this, as it may be only coincidence. But in the spring of 1907, Catherine visited my classroom to deliver some sewing work she had completed for the school. We spoke briefly. She seemed distracted. I asked if she was well, and she said, "Yes, but I had the strangest dream last night." I asked her what it was. She said, "I dreamed I was standing in the woods, and Daniel was walking away from me. I called to him, but he didn't turn around, and I realized that if I followed him, I would disappear." I laughed and told her it was only a dream. She laughed too, but she said, "I know, but I wonder if he's dreaming the same thing." The letter ends there. Merritt offers no further context. She does not claim the dream was prophetic. She simply thought Ida might find it interesting. If Catherine did have such a dream, and if Daniel knew about it, does it change what we think happened? Or does it merely deepen the mystery? Another fragment, this one from the files of Carl Webb, the private investigator hired by Thomas Ross. In his final report, Webb included an interview with a trapper named Owen Mackey, who had been working in the Cascades in late September 1907. Mackey claimed to have seen a man matching Daniel's description on or around September 28th, approximately 15 miles northwest of the campsite. The man was alone, walking at a steady pace, and did not respond when Mackey called out to him. Mackey noted, he looked like a man with a purpose, not lost, not panicked, just walking, like he knew exactly where he was going and didn't have time to stop. Webb asked if Mackey had seen anyone else in the area, 3 people perhaps following the man. Mackey said no, but then he added almost as an afterthought, "Though I did find tracks, 3 sets. They were heading in the same direction, but they were staggered, like whoever made them was walking single file and trying to step in the same places. It struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time." Webb's report does not speculate on the significance of this, but it raises a question. If Daniel was walking alone and the others were following, why were they walking so carefully? What were they trying not to disturb? Or what were they trying not to be seen by? The location where Daniel was found, a barren ridge, exposed and desolate, has been the subject of much speculation. In 1932, a geology professor from the University of Washington, Dr. Harold Finch, led a small expedition to the site as part of a study on erosion patterns. Finch's field notes archived at the university include an offhand observation. The ridge where Mercer was found is not a natural stopping point. There is no shelter, no water, no reason for anyone to be there, unless they were either lost or waiting for something. Given the accounts of his condition, he should not have been able to reach this location on foot. The terrain between the campsite and the ridge includes 2 river crossings and a near vertical climb. A man in his condition should have collapsed miles earlier. Finch does not offer an explanation. He simply notes the discrepancy and moves on. But the question remains, How did Daniel get there? And why did he stop there, of all places? One final piece of evidence, if it can be called that, comes from Daniel's house in Auburn. After his death, the property was sold to settle debts. The new owner, a shopkeeper named Raymond Voigt, found a locked trunk in the attic. Inside the trunk were Daniel's surveying tools, some old clothing, and a single photograph. The photograph showed 4 people standing outside a tent: Daniel, Catherine, Samuel, and Margaret. It had been taken during one of their earlier camping trips, probably in 1905 or 1906. On the back of the photograph, in Catherine's handwriting, were the words, "The 4 of us, happy." Beneath that, in a different hand, Daniel's, according to a handwriting analyst hired by a curious journalist in 1948, was a single line: "We were." Voigt donated the photograph to the Auburn Historical Society, where it remains today. It is the only known image of all 4 together. Daniel kept it. He locked it in a trunk. He never looked at it again, but he did not destroy it. What are we left with then? A man who walked out of the mountains alone and refused, for the rest of his life, to explain why. 3 people who vanished without a trace, leaving behind folded coats and half-written diaries. A campsite that showed no signs of struggle. A set of boot prints leading into the woods. A ridge where no one should have been. And a silence so absolute that it has outlasted everyone involved. Daniel Mercer did not forget. That much seems clear. He chose not to remember. Or more precisely, he chose not to speak what he remembered. Anne Cosgrove, the nurse, recorded his final cryptic words: "If I told you, you'd be the 4th. The 4th what? The 4th to know, the 4th to vanish, the 4th to bear the weight of whatever truth he carried." We cannot know. We can only speculate. And speculation, in the absence of evidence, is only another kind of silence. The historical record closes with Daniel's death in 1918. The case was never officially solved. The bodies of Catherine Mercer, Samuel Ross, and Margaret Ross were never recovered. The land where they disappeared has been logged, reforested, and logged again. If there are bones, they are buried beneath a century of growth and decay. Ida Ross lived until 1947. She never stopped looking for answers. Her final diary entry, written 3 days before her death, reads simply, "I have spent my life waiting for Catherine to come home. I know now that she will not, but I still do not know where she went. The families are gone. The investigators are gone. The journalists, the ministers, the accusers, all gone. Only the silence remains. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps Daniel Mercer understood something the rest of us do not. That some truths are not meant to be shared. That some events are so terrible, or so strange, or so deeply personal, that the only moral response is to bury them, not out of cowardice, but out of mercy. If I told you, you'd be the 4th. What did the first 3 know, or see, or become? We will never know. Daniel made certain of that, and in doing so, he left us with the only ending a story like this can have. Not resolution, but the echo of a door closing, quietly, firmly, forever.